Joseph! Cool! It's a list that didn't top. Wow! Hey everybody, it's your boy Joseph Rothschild, aka MBT, and today I'm showing you this. If you're unfamiliar, this past weekend I went to YCS Cancun and I had a wonderful time in the area. Thank you so much to everyone who came up and said hi, and everyone who was so absolutely kind to me, even though I clearly didn't know what I was doing. And I'm not talking about speaking Spanish, I'm talking about my gameplay. Anyway, if you follow me at twitter.com/mbtugio or x.com, depending on when this video is uploaded, you know that despite my best efforts, I did not top. So why am I showing you this list? Well, if I ramble for 8 minutes, then we make it to mid-roll, and that means that I make a lot of money. It's because I'm proud of it. This event I played better than I think I've ever played in the past. I played against better players than I've ever played in the past, and I came closer than I ever have to achieving that coveted YCS top. I'm gonna get it one of these days, and this is one stepping stone on that journey. I felt it would suck for a couple of weeks of work on my part to go to waste, so I'd like to bequeath this list unto you for use in your OTS championships before the metagame gets thrown into disarray because of AGOV. I'd of course like to thank the coaches and players who were able to help me with this list, but I'd also like to thank the individuals who jammed games with me, specifically Bean Soldier TV, who maybe played 30 hours of Yu-Gi-Oh against me in preparation for this event despite not going to it himself. Please sub to Bean Soldier. He's got to get something out of this. Anyway, let's talk about race. So I want to get a little more in depth in this profile than people usually do, and as a result I'm going to divide it into 4 different parts, the first of which is why I played Rescue Ace in the deck building process. I'm a busy man, and I know whatever deck I commit to I'm going to probably have to spend a couple of weeks actually getting good at before I feel confident enough in my own play. So coming out of the most recent format, it was clear that Kashtira was the deck to beat, and I was very specific with people that if I had to play one more second of Kashtira, I was going to jump. Sorry, I'm going to have to be a little more careful. I don't want to load up the ruler mirror again. As the metagame sort of shook out, it became clear there were about 6 standouts in the metagame: Kashtira, Pearly, Rescue Ace, Chimera, Labyrinth, and Unchained. I was sick to death of Kashtira because it tended to brick in a very specific way. Either you would find too many names and not be able to access your non-engine, putting up a board that every deck in the format was capable of beating, or you were unable to find any of your engine and you just bricked on non-engine and you were like, I hope that Ash gets me there. In my opinion, Chimera has pretty much the exact same problem, and for that reason, I wasn't really considering it. I like Pearly, but I felt it was so telegraphed insofar as what it did that people were going to be playing insane haymakers out of the board that were just going to frustrate me. Like, I don't know if I can deal just looking at a dimensional barrier every round. And I don't really like Lab. I just don't think it's particularly good. Unless your name's Ryan Yu. But I did really like Rescue Ace. I think that one thing that it has over other decks in the format is that it's incredibly flexible. While all of Pearly's cards are individually powerful, they all facilitate an end goal of making a big noir, right? And while you are, of course, trying to get to Turbulence set 4, you also have cards like Impulse that are just really good pieces of disruption or get you to your combo when you're going second and you haven't opened any part of it. You've got cards like Preventer that are a really neat type of interaction with your opponent and can facilitate this strange link climb thing. Games tend to play out differently based on what your hand looks like, and I really appreciate the ability to play games that are different and resolve differently based on the matchup and what you've opened. Unfortunately, really early into testing Rescue Ace, we found that it had kind of a middling Unchained matchup. This was not so bad when it looked like Unchained was going to be a cool hype deck that maybe people picked up, but it wasn't necessarily the deck to beat. But then 2 weeks ago happened, and then last week happened. And as a result, that became a problem we had to fix. As you can see, we're making a lot of non-engine choices based around beating specifically Unchained, but it also retooled our setup line to be making Abyss Dweller in any matchup where we can even remotely sniff out that our opponent is going to normal summon a Rikea. The second thing I want to talk about is some more macro decisions that we made, mostly what we're not playing. So frequently when I talk about this deck, individuals say to me, oh, the deck is so weak to cards like Evenly Matched and Lightning Storm, why don't you play Terahertz, which of course can send it to Save Worm and turn those cards off. I am not a fan of Terahertz currently. I don't want to rule out the possibility that he won't be a powerful thing you can do with the deck in the future, because I think a metagame that is more favorable for that kind of thing may erupt at some point. But right now, I feel like Terahertz is exceptionally weak to a lot. Firstly, people are playing a lot of cards to out specifically Arise Heart and Noir, and those cards cross over with outs for exactly Terahertz as well. Secondly, as Unchained increases in popularity, main deck Nibiru is becoming popular as well, and it walks directly into that. Thirdly, there is a huge cost to making the card. If your opponent is able to out it, they have not only turned off Monster Negation because you won't be able to send Mirror Logic Aggregator, they have also turned off the save room. Fourthly, I think one of the big strengths of this deck is that Triple Tactics Talents is an incredibly popular card that this deck does not necessarily have to play into. If most of your interaction is coming from a big Cyber Sky whose effect you have to activate, that's not necessarily the case. Other thing we're not playing is the Super Heavy Samurai engine. This one I thought a lot more realistically about. This engine does have tops plural, and it's not hard to see why. If you lack engine, it can go into Dempsey, which can get you engine. If you're against a problem matchup, it can make Abyss Dweller, which, as we've just discovered, is mission critical. And in the dark, you can go Merrymaker Sargass to go grab a negate if you are playing the king. I think all this theory makes sense. I think occasionally this deck does kind of lose to just not drawing the right parts of engine, and I can see why people would be willing to play it. For me, though, I really don't like the numbers. It's a 3-2 Garnet ratio, unless you play the bike, at which point it becomes a 3-1 Garnet ratio, but that really increases the chance that you find more than one piece of the Super Heavy Samurai engine, which you never want to do. A lot of people were talking about how the bike is upside because then you can play like Assault Stardust Dragon and make a Baron super early, but that's a bunch of spaces in the extra that you probably need to facilitate the flexibility of the Super Heavy Samurai line. Like, if you want to play Merrymaker Sargass, you have to get a bunch of spaces in the extra to do that. And in a format where, in order to have any game against Unchained whatsoever, you should probably be playing at least 12 pieces of interaction, it felt bad to be cutting those for like more starters. You should probably be playing 13. I mean, that's what the math supports. I am not doing that, which is probably not super good. And finally, I saw a bunch of people cutting to one Impulse. I think that Impulse is like the reason to play the deck. I think your Pearly matchup is specifically easy because of this card. I think it's an incredible way to ensure that you have names on your side of the field and then names in the graveyard for something like a Preventer or a Turbulence in order to start your turn, put a bunch of pressure on your opponent super early, potentially use the battle phase as removal spells. I don't get it. There's a Noah Green profile where he plays this deck. He shows off Impulse. He says, I don't know why people are playing this at 1. If this was at 5, I'd complain I can't play 6, and like I have to echo that. That's 100% correct. Okay, time for the card by card. Let's go through it. First up is Hydrant. Despite being the most powerful card in your deck, this card is not full combo on its own, which is frustrating. This card's protection effect is cool, of course, but it also puts you in this weird, frustrating position where you have a really tasty imperm target on Turbulence, but this card can never test for imperm because it can't be targeted in any scenario in which you're getting it out while you have a monster on the field. Despite that, obviously, it's crazy. It's incredible. Playing 3 copies of Airlifter here when it's normal or special summoned, you could add a Rescue Ace spell from your deck to your hand. This is one of my favorite things to get off of Impulse. You go Impulse for Fire Engine for Airlifter in order to ensure that you can start your turn with an emergency. It permits you to play through opponent's targeted interaction, but it also ensures that you don't have to commit to anything before you start going for plays that your opponent absolutely must interact with. Airlifter's also got this effect where it can tag out. A lot of people read this card and make the mistake of thinking that it's potentially interaction on your opponent's turn. It's not. The scenarios in which you're going to be able to have a monster on your side of the field like a Fire Engine, and then an Airlifter that you've summoned off the Fire Engine and a Preventer in hand are pretty few and far between. It's best to just think of this as a starter and not a lot else, in my opinion. Though it always could happen. Impulse is so unbelievably crazy. I mentioned a little bit earlier, but this is the reason that your Pearly matchup looks so good on paper. During the main phase, you can choose an effect monster your opponent controls with the highest attack, your choice of Tide, and neither player can activate that monster's effects on the field this turn. Your Pearly opponent is going to scratch their head when they realize that this affects the player, not their monsters, which means that it can turn off the effect of Big Noir. As a result, when you normal summon Impulse, your opponent is going to have to chain the Noir, and then you can activate the effect of the Impulse to summon from deck. If you bring out anything threatening, they'll have to activate Noir again, and suddenly the Noir can be destroyed. Just like normal stuff can get rid of it. This card is also insanely frustrating to play around. Frequently, you'll have something like Airlifter plus Rhoda in your opener, and just adding an Impulse at the end of your combo means an opponent is going to have a really rough time playing through what you have. It's kind of like Nibiru in that regard. Next up is 3 Rescue Ace Preventer. I really can't elucidate an important reason why I'm playing 3 and not 2. We're operating on vibes-based deck building here. No, there's a reason. So if you check out Max Reynolds' lists, or I think the other top 32 Rescue Ace list is also playing 2 of this card, which I do want to say is defensible. The thing about Preventer is you always really want to have 1 in rotation. If your combo is successful, you have a lot of opportunities to just add an extra guy to your hand. For instance, if you've opened Turbulence, you can use Hydrant to search the Preventer. If the Turbulence resolves and you have a Hydrant on your side of the field, you can use Alert in order to get the Preventer. It's a nice piece of an end board in that it is a Book of Moon, of course. It's mission critical in the lines that go from Proxy F Magician into Mud Dragon if you decide you want to play around Imperm. And if, more correctly in my opinion, you decide decide you want to play around Nibiru, it's really easy to summon Turbulence as the 4th summon and then use Preventer as the 5th summon, challenging your opponent to fire off a Nibiru that's not even going to be particularly profitable because you'll be able to proc the Preventer effect and end with the Rescue Ace on your side of the field, usually Hydrant, which is going to turn on the secondary effects of all of your spells and traps anyway. Using Preventer as part of the setup combo means that it'll be live in the graveyard for Rescue. It's a fantastic card to grab out of the graveyard, not only because it's defensive insofar as it gets monsters back on your side of the field when it leaves, but because it's also Book of Moon, and he's big. He's so good going second. You just summon this guy, you go to combat. However, you also really want to copy in your deck. Being able to wield Emergency as a piece of interaction, provided you've got access to another Rescue Ace card either in your hand or on the field, is incredibly strong. On a board with nothing, using Emergency to summon and then immediately pop Preventer and then trigger the effect of Preventer is fine. Impulse can summon any machine, not just Fire Engine, so there's a lot of scenarios like on turn 3 and beyond where you don't necessarily want to get this card because you don't expect your opponent to extend any further, or doing so won't enable you to interrupt your opponent in any sort of meaningful way, and you just grab Preventer instead. So you want to be able to have one that's like rotating between your hand, the field, and the graveyard, and one that's still in deck. I think that's more likely if you're playing more copies, but theoretically you could do so with just 2. As a side note, there's also some strange hands in which hard drawing Preventer just like turns on a combo in a way that a different card wouldn't. For instance, in my last game in Swiss, my opener was Prosby, Ibli, Hydrant, Preventer. The Prosby got ashed, which sounds like a loss, but you can normal the Hydrant, add the Turbulence, link off the Hydrant for a Link Haribo, summon Preventer by banishing the Hydrant, go into Proxy F, summon back the Hydrant, use Proxy F in order to go into Mud Dragon, summon the Turbulence, and still play around Imperm. Speaking of Turbulence, similar principle to Preventer, it's really nice to be able to play 2 of these cards. This is just more difficult to get out of your hand in case you happen to draw them. You want one that you can threaten from the position of the hand and one that you can threaten from the position of the deck. The one in the hand obviously threatens a lot. It's part of your mainline setup play, but it's also just like really big. Often I would find myself like summoning this card, activating the effect, and then just immediately going battle to try and clean up before I try to resolve anything else. Having one in the deck is also important so Emergency can specifically get it in a scenario where your Turbulence from hand is interrupted. This came up in my second to last game against Paulo, in which he was playing Kashtira. I had no knowledge of what he was playing. I went for Airlifter, activated Emergency, and it's at this point that Paulo activated Dimension Shifter. Unfortunately, that's the latest possible time you can activate Dimension Shifter, because if you don't activate Dimension Shifter there, I go get Hydrant, add Turbulence, and banish the 2 cards from my graveyard to get Turbulence out in a position where I've also got Hydrant. But if you Dimension Shifter there, I'm not going to be able to use Turbulence to summon itself from my hand, so I have to use the Emergency that is resolving to go get Turbulence, and then the cards are banished, but who cares, I'm setting 4. And finally, the last thing we're playing is a Fire Engine. This is just the summon off of Impulse. Being an extra body does come up. There are a lot of scenarios on turn 3 where you have the capacity to search a card that you don't already have while everything else is already in rotation. This is one more body on field that can assemble an access code line while you have something like an Abyss Dweller up. Theoretically, this also does chain block Airlifter, but in no scenario is that particularly useful. Anything your opponent would be interacting with Airlifter on is going to be targeted negation. Also, Fire Engine only really chain blocks against Ash Blossom, and there's already a really tasty Ash Blossom target in this deck in Emergency. It's mostly just the search target off of Impulse. He's big too, by the way. He's huge. He's enormous. My opponent would just pass back to me after I'd Impulse, and I had like Fire Engine, Airlifter, and I'd just go, okay, boop, boop, attack. Spells. They gotta ban this card, man. Holy guacamole. Emergency is an incredible card. It's obviously absolutely crazy. You go from Airlifter to Emergency to Hydrant to Turbulence, and then you just fart them out. But it's also flexible, which is very frustrating. An inexperienced opponent who is imperming super early could get caught by Emergency, where you Emergency and then tribute the card that's being impermed. Holding an Emergency in a scenario where you have like access to an Airlifter and a Hydrant and an Emergency in the grip means that you can search a Rescue Ace HQ, and then the Emergency can be used to tag out for a copy of Turbulence if your opponent interrupts with one of them. You can also banish it from the graveyard to reset traps. Like, what the hell? Why is that line on there? This card's already crazy. We're playing one apiece of Alert and Rescue. I want to talk real specifically about Rescue real quick because I think people are unwilling to engage with this card, which seems like a weird thing to say. They conceptualize it as like, oh, this is one of the 4 cards you set off of Turbulence. But it's so much more than that. There are a lot of scenarios where you have Airlifter and Emergency in hand. You're playing both of 3. And in those scenarios, people kind of tend to default to Rescue Ace HQ, but I'd urge you to consider Rescue as a potential target. There are a lot of scenarios where like I can summon a Turbulence from hand over the course of the turn, but my opponent has like targeted removal and is able to remove it. And just fetching a Rescue off of something like an Airlifter means that like now I can contest that removal and like potentially resolve the effect of Turbulence, which functionally wins on the spot. Like this is a really good card, even if it's not just a thing you're searching off Turbulence. And if you do search it, oh no, Turbulence has to set emergency. Oh god, not an E-Telly. I've seen people try and cut Rescue Ace HQ. I understand it. This card was crazy for me all weekend. The double summon's incredibly powerful in terms of hiding information. It permits you to kind of obfuscate what your like choke point normal summon is. The 500 attack means that you can go to combat to clean up like a significant amount of your opponent's board. Something like a fire engine and an airlifter under Rescue Ace HQ contests like almost any board in the game. The shuffle back, of course, is incredible, but I think it resolved at once over the course of the weekend. The number one thing this card did was eat removal. People were very excited to destroy this thing. We're playing Reinforcement of the Army in 1-for-1. I really don't like playing 1-for-1. It's such an investment, but it's one of the only ways that you can play through Ash Blossom, which on emergency is just absolutely devastating, so I am playing it. And of course, we're playing Contain and Extinguish. Extinguish, thankfully, is one of the cards that makes your Unchained matchup not just a 100-0. Deploying it and then recycling it off in emergency is, mission critical. For non-engine, we're playing Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. I felt like this card had the best coverage of any of the other non-engine slots. DD Crow, late in testing, we were trying to figure out what the best potential thing we could be playing against Unchained that wasn't just completely dead in other matchups was. I was testing Druis Worm in this slot, and it just kept coming up that my opponent wasn't playing light and dark monsters. Crow way overperformed for me at the event. Obviously, it was quite good against Unchained. It was also pretty good against Pearly. Theoretically, it has some application in every matchup, with the exception, of course, of Kashtira, but what are you going to do? Nibiru was okay for me. This is here for Unchained, but unfortunately Unchained pilots are just getting better. Against less good Unchained pilots, it felt almost mandatory and game-winning every single time I saw it, and against good ones, I just stared at it. I just said, oh boy. We're playing 3 Book of Eclipse. This is a card that I would consider cutting in future editions of the deck. We were playing 6 books at one point during testing, which I really liked because this deck really benefits from having Book of Moon, but unfortunately Book is just so absolutely miserable against Unchained that I didn't feel it was right to register it. Book of Eclipse is occasionally like a turn stopper, which is nice, and it does also do the thing that books do, which is out the problem monsters, with the exception of exactly Nightmare Griffin, which was never made against me, and to my understanding isn't something that Unchained pilots are taking particularly seriously anymore anyway. In the side, the Druis Worms are in here for Unchained. So I know there are mechanisms by which Unchained can play around this card, either by going incredibly minus to make something like an access code talker, or by refusing to put a light or a dark into the graveyard until really late into the combo, keeping Yama on field as long as possible. That said, I still found this card incredibly good against that strategy. I'll probably register it again. Droll's a weird card. I felt like it wasn't exactly Droll's time, but at the very last minute it became clear that we were going to have to take Dragon Link seriously, and we were already toying with copies of Droll in the sideboard as a mechanism by which we could beat some strange decks that just drew a whole bunch of cards. That crossover was enough for me to register 3 copies, and it was good for me all weekend because I did play a bunch of decks that incidentally lost to Droll. Ibli is strange. If you've seen Max's deck, it's in the main, and I think that's defensible. The deck does have a super consistent Ibli line. It's just a 1 card off of Airlifter, but I personally was a little afraid of Kashtira and Labyrinth playing copies of Lingaribo. It's not like the Kashtira mirror where you just wouldn't perform a normal, and then at the end of your combo you would just go Nightmare Corruptor Ibli, give it to your opponent, and maybe they had a Lingaribo, maybe they didn't. So much of this deck's power is concentrated in the 2 traps that you set off of Turbulence that if your opponent's playing Lingaribo, it's actually a real problem. Going first when I could be confident that my opponent's extra was tight, I would board into this. Unfortunately, the matchup in which I'd hoped it would have the most effect, Unchained, it was not very good, and that is because they contribute over it with Sharvara. And it's not terrible. This is terror. It's an awful normal. Lightning Storm. This deck has a real problem with back row, as I'm sure you've gathered. It is bad enough that I was not confident boarding evenly against back row decks because there are a significant number of back row decks in the format in which a single card just beats me anyway. These last 2 are a little more contentious. We're playing Xyz Encore and Grave of the Super Ancient Organism. So Xyz Encore was a really late addition to the deck. I probably would not play this at another event. The concept is that we're playing cards like DD Crow that don't have a lot of application against Kashtira, and Nibiru, which if our opponent sees game 1, game 2, and 3, they will probably not play into if they're on Kashtira, meaning we can safely board into this card, which is really good against them, and is also individually powerful against Pearly, against which a significant amount of our cards, Nibiru for instance, are not good at all. In practice, the only times I saw this, it was part of a 2 or 3 card combo where I'd already won the game anyway, or it was absolutely useless, as was the case when I played against Tom and Swiss. This was the first time I'd ever played Xyz Encore in a list, and the night before the event, I was just running over it in my head. I asked Brian of Crush Cards, who was on Pearly, about Xyz Encore. And I was like, I don't understand. Doesn't this trigger my friend Pearly? And Brian was like, no, I don't think it does. And I said, are you sure? And he said, pretty. And then I activated it against Tom and Swiss, and he goes, my friend Pearly. And I went, this triggers my friend Pearly? And then he went, yeah, why wouldn't it? So I called over a judge, and I was like, does this trigger my friend Pearly? And the judge was like, yeah, why wouldn't it? And I was like, what the fuck? And then I remember that Brian and I had been drinking. Finally, we're on Grave of the Super Ancient Organism. This was the slot the Dimensional Barrier was in, but I kind of like this card a little more than Dimensional Barrier. Dimensional Barrier almost always exists to play against Pearly when you are going first, but this deck already has a pretty good matchup versus Pearly. It's got like in-archetype books. Going second, it has like Impulse, and you'd never be boarding into a Dimensional Barrier in that scenario anyway, so it became clear that we were basically boarding a card for one individual matchup in one particular scenario. In my head, I justified it by being like, well, it hits Chimera as well, but Chimera can easily get into a position where like they can just set the Chimera fusion and just do it on your turn. Pretty much every time I saw this card, though, I wished it had been anti-spell. Extra deck, Mud Dragon. So you'll notice that we're not playing Imperm anywhere in the 55. I had felt that pretty much every top deck has an in-archetype mechanism by which they can avoid getting Impermed. Unchained can like Sharvara pop, Rescue Ace has Emergency, Chimera can just activate Chimera fusion. That said, holding an Imperm for a Turbulence is actually super strong. In a perfect world, I probably wouldn't be playing this card or Proxy F Magician, but I got to a position where I figured I feel Imperm is bad, but I'm not confident that other people will also feel Imperm is bad for this event. As I got into later rounds, I transitioned to playing around Nibiru rather than playing around Imperm, meaning I wasn't making this guy at all. We got Abyss Dweller. This guy's pretty easy to make. As long as you've got any Rescue Ace in your hand, you can normal summon Airlifter, activate Emergency, pitching the Rescue Ace in hand to grab a copy of Rescue Ace Hydrant, and then just execute the existing Puzzle Amino combo you all know and love off of this guy, Gigantic Sprite, into a Eebly, except this time you are going to use Puzzle Amino to modulate the card you summon back off of Preventer into a 4 so you can overlay for this monster. It went all right. I remember when this deck first came out and people weren't playing access code. You gotta end the game somehow. Beat Cop is here to protect the Ibly. Hita's unbelievable. All weekend I missed Dark. I almost considered not playing Proxy F Magician and Mud Dragon just so I could force Dark back into the extra. Hita did a lot of work regardless. Masquerade is part of a best of all possible worlds end board, but also she's one of your best cards against back row decks because it allows you to threaten Topologic Trisbana really early. Phoenix and Unicorn are pretty self-explanatory. I used Phoenix against a Versus Soul player. They flipped up Teekboo and I went, okay, Warrior and Machine into Fiend. God, that deck. Lingria was here to get the Hydrant off the field, but also it's the quick summon for Trisbana a lot of the time. Proxy F is a Fire Cyburst for Mud Dragon. Puzzle Amino is probably the best card in the deck. Did you know this card has a second effect? Anima is a card that I cut pretty early and then added back later. There are a lot of decks in the format that just can't help but play around the Anima zone. Like you can theoretically get out the Unchained activation of Rage super early just by making this guy. He kept coming up. It's also nice to not have to make a Nightmare to get rid of the Nibiru token. I like Sunlight Wolf a lot. I think a significant amount of the time if you're resolving Turbulence, the only thing you lose to is not having any follow-up, and this always guarantees you do have it. I also in testing was able to get into a position against a Labyrinth player where I could just add back Ash every turn, and they were just so frustrated. And Trisbana is a weird choice for sure. A lot of people play Heat Leo in this slot, which I think is very defensible. I'm playing Trisbana for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it's almost a time card. Like, it requires your opponent to play into it in time, which is, I mean, probably not going to happen. But there are some decks that just can't help but play into it. It's also your anti-time card because it's a mechanism by which you can get rid of the Dark contract. I also was really frightened of decks that, rather than just putting up like one or two pieces of back row floodgates or maybe a Runic Fountain that I'd have to Heat Leo away, would just set 5. This card's better against that, I suppose. So I guess I'll conclude like this. I think this deck is really strong. I think it's got a lot of room to grow. I think its lines are flexible enough that it will be able to adapt to upcoming metagames. But unfortunately, I think at present it has kind of a mid-Unchained matchup. I'd characterize it as like a 35-65, which is really not where you want to be against the deck to beat. That said, Agov really does improve things for this deck. While I talked a bunch of shit on the Super Heavy Samurai engine and its ability to find your engine, I think the Abel Star is a Garnet ratio that I'm a lot more comfortable with and enables a lot of plays in the archetype in order to just kind of have material on your side of the field that you can use to access a very flexible extra deck. It's a deck to watch for sure. It's a deck I think is going to get better, and it's a deck that, to play at optimal capacity, does require a lot of thinking, which I'm not used to. Time will tell if I'll play it again, but I appreciate you all watching this one. Okay, bye-bye.